Welcome to Learning English, where you are ready to level up your skills. Here we learn through stories that are slow, clear, and fun. Just listen, relax, and enjoy the journey. 1. Introduction in the Middle East. A peace deal was recently brokered. It marked a moment when conflicting nations agreed to a temporary halt in hostilities. This peace, however, was not strong or certain. It was described as a fragile peace deal. The word fragile signifies that it could be broken very easily. The President of the United States, Mr. Trump, was an essential figure in forging this agreement. During his second presidential term, he served as the central negotiator, helping the opposing sides communicate and find a path to de-escalate the conflict. President Trump hoped this deal would bring tranquility to a volatile region of the world. Preceding this peace deal was a significant military action. This major operation was carried out by the United States military and involved attacking key locations in one of the nations involved in the conflict. The official name of this military action was Operation Midnight Hammer. Following this large-scale operation, the ceasefire was agreed upon. People across the globe watched this situation with intense focus. They felt anxious about the outcome. Anxious means feeling worried and nervous. The global community hoped that the military action, combined with the peace deal, would genuinely stop the fighting and restore stability. The ceasefire was a promise to end the violence, but the peace did not last long. News quickly emerged that the ceasefire had collapsed. The agreement to stop fighting was broken. This grave news heightened global anxieties, confirming that the fragile peace was over. The situation immediately raised many urgent questions. Everyone wanted to know what caused the ceasefire to fail so soon after it began. Who broke the agreement first? What would the countries do now? The fighting escalate into a much larger war. The end of the ceasefire created a deeply uncertain and perilous time for everyone. 2. A peace deal is made. A ceasefire agreement was reached between Israel and Iran, aiming to halt the ongoing fighting. The context for this ceasefire involved a major military operation by the United States. The U.S. military had conducted a mission known as Operation Midnight Hammer, with the primary objective of targeting specific nuclear sites within Iran. President Donald Trump was central to this effort, determined to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. His strategy involved using military force to pressure Iran into negotiations. The U.S. military reported that Operation Midnight Hammer was a great success, stating that the targeted nuclear facilities were destroyed. President Trump publicly affirmed this, remarking that the sites were gone, eliminated under rocks. He also praised the American pilots who executed the difficult, lengthy operation, calling it a successful mission whose participants should be celebrated. This decisive military action paved the way for diplomatic efforts. The United States assumed a leading role in brokering the peace deal, with Qatar also playing a significant part in the negotiations. Representatives from the U.S. and Qatar worked to bring Israel and Iran to the table to discuss an end to the conflict. The path to this ceasefire was marked by violence and loss. According to Iranian reports, the conflict had resulted in over 400 deaths, including 13 children and more than 3,000 injuries. In Israel, attacks from Iran had caused at least 24 fatalities. These heavy casualties underscored the urgent need for a pause in hostilities. President Trump expressed a keen desire to be the negotiator in this conflict, appearing to believe his approach of combining military pressure with diplomacy was effective. The peace deal was finally agreed upon, establishing a temporary period free from active combat. The world watched, hopeful that this agreement would hold and lead to a more stable future. The roles of the U.S. and Qatar were crucial in guiding these longtime adversaries to a point where they could agree to stop fighting, even for a limited time. 3. The clock ticks down. The time for peace was rapidly approaching. With the hour for the ceasefire to commence just a few hours away, a palpable tension hung in the air. In the lead-up to the peace deal, Israel continued its military actions. Israeli forces worked to finalize strikes on a list of predetermined targets, using the last available hours before the deadline to complete their missions. They maintained their bombing campaign until the final moments, just before the ceasefire was scheduled to begin. A terrible incident occurred. A large missile, was fired from Iran, but it did not strike a military installation. Instead, it hit a civilian apartment building in Israel. The missile strike was incredibly powerful, causing extensive damage. Tragically, people were inside the building when it was impacted. 4 individuals were killed in the attack, and another 26 were injured to varying degrees. This attack, occurring at the very threshold of peace, provoked immense anger in Israel. The deaths and injuries of civilians created powerful emotions. This event, happening so close to the appointed time for peace, made future understanding extremely difficult and set the stage for the anger and complications that would follow. The fragile peace was already jeopardized by what transpired in these final minutes. 4. A new attack. The peace was short-lived. Ceasefire had just begun, and people were hoping for a period of calm. But this hope was quickly shattered. Missiles were launched from an unknown location and landed in Israel after the ceasefire was supposed to be in effect. In response to the missile impacts, Israel reacted swiftly. They announced that the truce was over, declaring that Iran was responsible for firing the missiles. Israel stated that this new attack was a blatant violation of the agreement. Iran, however, told a different story. They denied firing the missiles and refuted any responsibility for the attack. This created a confusing situation. Who had fired the missiles? Why did it happen just as the peace was starting? With Israel blaming Iran and Iran issuing a denial, the truth was difficult to discern. This new attack worsened everything. The brief period of peace was finished, and tension between the two nations surged once more. The dangerous situation that everyone hoped had passed had returned with renewed anger. The world watched as a small chance for peace vanished. The incident demonstrated how difficult it is to halt fighting after a prolonged conflict. The missiles that struck Israel after the ceasefire began changed everything, making the path to peace seem much more arduous. The confusion over responsibility only compounded the problems. It was a disastrous start for the ceasefire, and perhaps its immediate end. 5. A president is angry from the White House. President Trump received the unsettling news. The peace deal he helped orchestrate was broken. Missiles were once again flying between Israel and Iran. President Trump felt intense emotions, a mix of anger and frustration. Speaking publicly about the situation, he expressed his displeasure with both Israel and Iran. He used strong language to convey his anger, noting that the two countries had been fighting for so long they might not even remember the reason. They just continued. He was particularly unhappy with Israel's actions following the ceasefire's collapse. He gave Israel a direct order, stating, "Bring your pilots home now," indicating he wanted their bombing campaign to cease immediately. He felt Israel was reacting too quickly or too forcefully. President Trump also had issues with the media's coverage of the conflict, which he felt was unfair. He was proud of the U.S. military for completing a major and important mission before the ceasefire, and he believed this mission was highly successful. He thought the news should report more positively on the military's achievements and show more respect for the soldiers and pilots, which irritated him. He had worked hard to broker peace and wanted to be a peacemaker in the Middle East. The ceasefire was a significant step, but it hadn't lasted. When fighting resumed, he was deeply disappointed, feeling his efforts were not respected by either side. He used social media to share his thoughts, writing a direct message to Israel, telling them again not to drop bombs and warning that continuing to do so would be a big violation. He also commented on Iran's actions, calling their missile attack, after the ceasefire, a very weak response, suggesting their military capability had been diminished by the American mission. President Trump was preparing to leave for an important NATO summit in Europe, the first of his second term. He had hoped for peace in the region upon his departure, but the conflict had returned. He felt Israel's fierce counterattack was partly due to the pre-ceasefire missile strike that killed civilians, but he still believed Israel should have shown more restraint after Iran officially broke the truce. From the White House, President Trump displayed his anger at the fighting, the nations involved, and the media's portrayal of events. Leaving for his trip with the situation still highly uncertain and dangerous. 6. The two sides of the story after the brief peace collapsed. Both countries addressed the world, offering starkly different accounts of why the fighting had resumed. In Israel, Defense Minister Israel Katz was unequivocal, stated that Iran had violated the ceasefire agreement first. Consequently, he ordered the Israeli army to conduct intense strikes on targets in Tehran. The minister asserted that Israel had to respond with force because Iran failed to uphold the peace deal. Israel's position was that Iran's attack, just after the truce began, necessitated a strong response. The government in Iran, however, presented a completely different narrative. They declared it was untrue that Iran had broken the ceasefire and that Israel's claim was false. Iran's top security council also issued a stern warning to Israel, stating that Iran's army was prepared to respond swiftly and powerfully to any action from Israel. They characterized Israel's actions as aggression, meaning unprovoked attacks. The world thus heard two conflicting explanations for why the peace had ended. Israel claimed Iran attacked first post-ceasefire, forcing them to retaliate. Claimed they did not attack, and that Israel was striking them without justification to restart the conflict. The conflict became a war fought not only with missiles, but also with words and accusations, as both nations placed the blame entirely on the other. Israel framed its strikes as a necessary defense against Iran breaking the rules. Iran argued that Israel was merely seeking an excuse to resume fighting. This divergence made the situation far more dangerous and made it nearly impossible for outside observers to determine the truth. The brief peace was utterly finished, replaced by anger and blame. The leader's language was severe, the Israeli defense minister ordering intense attacks and the Iranian government proclaiming its innocence and readiness to defend itself. 7. Big questions are asked in the wake of the failed peace. Many people began to think deeply, asking significant questions about the entire situation. Pundits and experts who study these events engaged in widespread discussion, analyzing Israel, Iran, and the recent turn of events. Some experts scrutinized the ceasefire deal itself, questioning if it was a good idea from the start. They argued that before the ceasefire, Iran appeared to be in a position of weakness. Recent military operations had damaged Iran's capabilities, including parts of its air force. Allies that might typically support Iran, such as China and Russia, had not offered substantial help. Iran therefore seemed to need the peace agreement to rebuild its strength. This led some to ask if the ceasefire had inadvertently provided Iran with a lifeline, a term for something that saves someone in danger. These observers wondered if giving Iran this lifeline was a strategic error, and if maintaining pressure on Iran while it was vulnerable would have been better. Another major question concerned Iran's actions. Why would Iran fire missiles after the ceasefire began? This was baffling to many. Iran seemingly had more to gain from the peace than Israel did, so breaking the deal appeared counterproductive. Various theories were discussed. Perhaps it wasn't a coordinated plan from Iran's top leadership, but a mistake by a lower-level commander or an unauthorized action by a rogue faction. Alternatively, it might have been a symbolic gesture, a minor attack to show they could still fight, rather than a genuine effort to end the peace. Regardless of the reason, this action brought the ceasefire to a swift end. People also considered the bigger picture. Can Israel and Iran ever achieve long-term peace? The two nations hold fundamentally different worldviews. Some analysts argued it is incredibly difficult to make peace with a nation that openly calls for your destruction, pointing to Iran's official stance against Israel's existence and its hostility toward Western nations like the United States. Their ideology is starkly different, viewing Westerners as infidels or non-believers. How can you negotiate peace with those who perceive you as an enemy in such an absolute way? This was a profound question for everyone contemplating the future. With the ceasefire broken, these hard questions remained. 8. The world watches after. The ceasefire ended. The future looked profoundly uncertain. The peace deal was shattered, and the situation remained extremely fragile. No one knew what would happen next. Across the globe, people monitored the news with deep concern. Trump, an architect of the peace deal, had to travel to a major NATO summit with other world leaders. His departure, while the Middle East crisis was unresolved, highlighted the ongoing and pressing nature of the situation. In the Middle East, tensions remained high. Both Israel and Iran were on high alert, with their armies poised for potential combat. Following the ceasefire's collapse, both sides were prepared for further conflict, and there was widespread worry that the fighting could escalate into a larger war. The world waited to see what would transpire. Would the two sides engage in a full-scale war? Or could diplomacy find a way to reopen dialogue and save the situation? The fragile peace was gone, and the next steps were unknown. Everyone waited and watched, hoping for a positive resolution but fearing the worst.